preliminary remarks. First, you get a sense of that anyway. The title doesn't exactly reflect what my paper is now, so I planned it when I forwarded the title a bit differently, but it came out as you will immediately hear, so I apologize for that. I hope very slight discontinuity between title and text. And the second remark is that my fundamental, basic, or at least initial argument is very much opposite to the argument of Maritain we just heard about. That is, the fundamental statement I built my paper on and my argument on is that disorder is the fundamental disposition of the human person. And in order to illustrate that and somehow prove it's not my own idea, I'll point your attention to a saying that is present in many, if not all, modern languages, a saying that may be able to capture a kind of popular conviction that seems to be rooted in the common wisdom and experience of most people. All is fair in love and war. Tout est permis en amour et à la guerre. In amore e in guerra tutto è lecito. In der Liebe und im Krieg ist alles erlaubt. And so on and so forth. In Russian and in Polish and in Spanish and in Portuguese. I don't know about non-Indo-European languages. If I don't know the Chinese language or Arabic or Swahili or whatever have such a saying, but Indo-European languages all have it. So love, understood in this, you have it? Love, obviously understood in this particular context rather as eros than agape or philia. Love and war appear thus to belong to something that we call, since Thomas Hobbes, a state of nature. And therefore are exterior to any legal order and also are immune to moral judgment. In love and war, there is no proper room for loyalty, gratuity, commitment, or shame. Instead, everything goes unsanctioned. Conceit, deception, treachery, aggression, cruelty. That is why the first Christians firmly believed that there is not such a thing as a Christian soldier. Carnal love, as well as bearing and using arms, were considered by the new people of God as natural inclinations they had to harness, if not completely renounce. Since the 4th century, and especially after the development of canon law, both inclinations were in the end not really rejected, but rather tamed, disciplined, and regulated. Thus emerged the theory of just war, which is perhaps one of the greatest theoretical illusions of organized Christianity. In the traditional Catholic moral thinking, just war theory intended to limit and constrain both when war is justified, jus ad bellum, and how it is conducted, jus in bellum. In recent years, this tradition also yielded criteria and practices for jus post bellum, justice after war, so as to put a firm end to the collective use of violence. This tradition includes also, and this is important to emphasize, a peace imperative, a ius pacem commitment for conducting a just war in such a way that a just peace could be its result. None of the features of the typical just war theory is present today in the overall support for the war in Ukraine, which is interpreted in the Western media and in most Western churches, be them Catholic, Orthodox, or Protestant, as a good war, if not as a must-do war, a war fought from afar and by proxy, a war fought by everyone. Here is a blatant example. The previous and very short-lived Prime Minister of Britain, Liz Truss, in her first speech given before the doors of 10 Downing Street after coming back from Buckingham Palace, set for her mandate 3 objectives: curb unemployment, reduce inflation, and continue the war against Putin. As Britain was at war against Russia. Most Western governments and many media outlets are actually at war in their own minds. The American Society of Friends, the Quakers, warned prophetically long ago in 1944 that the main task of all Christians is to, I quote, to prevent the militarization of the human mind. There are, however, some theological reasons why lament rather than cheerleading should be the appropriate response to the good war narrative that prevails today with respect to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We may quote first the disproportionate commitment of the West to help Ukraine resist invasion and overturn the military odds when compared with conflicts elsewhere. The just war criterion of proportionality is usually restricted to the consideration of whether the means used are proportional to the end sought. But a genuine Christian approach should also question the proportionality of the reaction of the Western governments to various conflicts going on in the world. The enormous aid, both in relief funds and in military equipment for Ukraine, has been motivated by a concern for the victims of the invasion. The suffering of millions in Ukraine has attracted a widespread empathy from governments, NGOs, churches, and citizens alike. In the recent past, several million Syrians, Libyans, or Sudanese civilians had to flee their homelands, but only about 20% of them have been welcomed in various Western countries. Since the invasion of Ukraine more than 1 year ago, the number of Ukrainian refugees accepted by most European nations is about 4 times the number of Middle Eastern and North African refugees these nations harbored in the 10 years since the civil wars began in the region of North Africa and the Middle East. William Kavanagh pointed out that the United States has implemented a fast-track refugee status for Ukrainian citizens, while other refugees from places like the Democratic Republic of the Congo have to wait in line, and wait, and wait, and wait. The conflict in Congo has been the bloodiest in the world since World War II, with the number of casualties dwarfing those of the Ukrainian conflict, even if we believe Ukrainian media saying that 300,000 people have died. There were even more people died in Central Africa, in Congo, in the last year than in Ukraine, and nobody seems to care. No one takes heed to war there, even if many of the parties involved in the conflict in Congo are at least nominally Christian. Pope Francis famously remarked that a third war fought piecemeal is unfolding not only in Ukraine, but also in the Middle East, in Myanmar, and in most places in Africa. In the second place, we should, in the face of war, take seriously the fact that the division of the world into nations and nation states is, according to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, a provisional economy. Christians belong to the kingdom of God and are mere resident aliens wherever they live, and regardless of the roots they have in a particular place and of the ties they have with a given language or ethnicity. There is no reason embedded in the gospel for a Christian to consider that the nation state, his own or the nation state of his allies or friends, has an absolute value and is worth dying for. Nation states, together with their governments, flags, territories, institutions, and borders, are challenged by the Christian demand for Catholicity. Christians have the imprescriptible duty to proclaim that the whole human race is called to join the indivisible Church of Christ and to be one. Defending the territorial integrity of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian nation state, that is the border Ukraine has had since 1991, is not an absolute value. And in the case of Kosovo, we can see currently on TV the riots there around precisely the issue of the border between the so-called Republic of Kosovo and the Republic of Serbia. Borders do not appease violence, but stir it. Famously, for almost 100 years, are the borders that are not allowing the Kurds to be a nation in itself. There are Kurds in North Iraq, in Turkey, in Iran, in Syria. Nobody cares about and then no one of the countries involved that had these borders since the 20s and the 30s are willing to recognize that there is such a thing as a Kurdish nation, regard what happened in Turkey with the presidential election. The very fact of pronouncing the word Kurd in Turkey may bring you to jail immediately. There are no Kurds in Turkey, even if everyone knows that about 20% of the population of the Republic of Turkey, that is many, many millions, is formed by Kurds. So borders never appease violence, but rather stir it. It is really justified to support, as the West does today, carnage in order to defend borders. Is there something close to the sanctity of borders? Are borders even mentioned in Christian literature before the emergence of the modern state and the rise of established national churches? The weightiest reason to question the good war narrative is that death on a battlefield is not a victory of the good, but a failure in the preaching of the gospel. There is no such thing as a good war, a patriotic war, a war worth being fought and supported. There is no doubt that the invasion of Ukraine is unjust. But we are not even theoretically, in the position to distinguish between an unjust and criminal slaughter of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians by Russians and the just and well-deserved slaughter of Russian soldiers by Ukrainian freedom fighters. We may also ask, but this is a kind of different track, if there is really freedom in Ukraine, or Ukraine fought for freedom, if they really defend Europe. If Ukraine is a European country, they claim to be, but I would say that both Russia and Ukraine are twin daughters of the Soviet Union, and I stop any comment in that direction. I was absolutely appalled to see last year, during Easter, a broadcast that was present on most networks of a Ukrainian, very young boy in a uniform in a church somewhere in Kiev or near Kiev. And he was answering the reporter about the war and what he's doing, fighting on the front, saying, our problem in Ukraine is that we lack faith. Had we had more faith, we would have killed all Russians by now. So for me, it was appalling to see that in a church, Christian soldiers, so to speak, established a relationship between the level of faith and the ability to kill the enemies. We ought to lament the slaughter on both sides. Pope Francis has been criticized for not standing more firmly for Ukraine's defense, but he may be striving to accomplish something more difficult, to respond to the invasion and the slaughter as a follower of Jesus Christ. In his Angelus on March 13 last year, he referred obviously to Russia's unacceptable armed aggression. Yet he added that those who support violence profane God's name, since God is only the God of peace. Was this concluding sentence pointed merely at the military aggressor, or also at the Ukrainian citizens who took up arms in defense of their country? On several occasions, including in a recent call for people to pray during the month of April for a culture on non-violence and peace, Pope Francis has claimed that any war, any armed confrontation, and I quote, always ends in defeat for all. Accordingly, he encourages us to discard any recourse to violence. Let us make non-violence, and I quote again, a guide for our actions, both in daily life and in international relations. This reference to non-violence appeared already in Francis' 2017 World Day of Peace message, Non-Violence, a Style of Politics for Peace, which he wrote at the request of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, a project of Pax Christi International. In April of the prior year, 2016, Pax Christi International and the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace sponsored a non-violence and just peace conference that issued an appeal to the Catholic Church to recommit to the centrality of gospel non-violence. while urging the Church to promote education and training in active nonviolence, the appeal asserted that, and I quote, there is no just war, and that often the just war theory has been used to endorse rather than prevent or limit war. The appeal went on to recommend that the Church should no longer use or teach just war theory. Pope Francis has appeared to embrace this recommendation, as he wrote in his 2020 encyclical Fratelli Tutti that, and I quote, "It is very difficult nowadays to invoke the rational criteria elaborated in earlier centuries to speak of the possibility of a just war. Never again war." End of quote. He thus joined, probably without being fully aware of their perspectives on Christian ethics, two of the most influential critics of just war theories, Stanley Hauerwas and John Howard Yoder. We should acknowledge that whatever else it is in political and legal terms, the war in Ukraine is a massive failure by Christians on all sides to imagine the world as their teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, asked them to do. Christ asked us to love our enemies, to respond to an excess of evil with an excess of love. We rarely care to ask ourselves what that might look like. But the just war tradition is not an ethical device to justify violence, as it recognizes, however, the primacy of non-violence. A rigorous moral test should be passed before violence could even be used. Even where such conditions are met, violence is always a recognition of a failure. Non-violence should be the default position for a Christian. Avoiding carnage might take priority over defending borders. Non-violent civilian defense, non-cooperation, and peaceful protest might constitute a strategy for making the occupied regions of Ukraine ungovernable by the Russians. As Pope Francis has pointed out, the Russian-led constellation of communist regimes fell 30 years ago because of non-violent protest. Why not imagine that it might happen again? Non-violent resistance, however, is not just a plausible strategy to defend Ukraine, but also a path to conversion for all the parties involved in the conflict. As Pope Benedict XVI said, and I quote, "For Christians, non-violence is not merely a tactical behavior, but a person's way of being. The attitude of one who is so convinced of God's love and power that he or she is not afraid to tackle evil with the weapons of love and truth alone. Love of one's enemy constitutes the nucleus of the Christian revolution." And I end the quote. And I add another quote from another period, published in 1938 in the Catholic Worker by Dorothy Day. And the line were pointed to the civil war in Spain. And Day says, "There must be a disarmament of the heart." 6 years later, the Quakers said a disarmament of the mind. She says a disarmament of the heart. Yes, wars will go on. We are living in a world where even nature itself travaileth and groaneth due to the fall. But we cannot sit back and say, human nature being what it is, you cannot get a man to overcome their adversary by love. We are afraid of the word love, and yet love is stronger than death, stronger than hatred. If we do not emphasize the law of love, we betray our trust, our vocation. We must stand opposed to the use of force. we are not talking of passive resistance. Love and prayer are not passive, but a most active, glowing force. And we ask with grief, who are they among us who pray with faith and with love, and so powerfully that they can move the mountains of hatred that stand in our path. So to conclude, men tend to be, whenever they can, warlords. Christ, as Liz Truss claimed to be as a newly appointed prime minister, Christ is the Prince of Peace. War is a human endeavor. Peace is the work of God. Therefore, peace is not the legal and political absence of war, but the fallout of love. You cannot conclude and legislate peace simply because peace is a gift. It is not in the nature of man. It is the social outcome of discipleship. Thank you.
Thank you very much.